women had a higher number of anti-inflammatory molecules. And we thought that's strange because they're more prone to autoimmune diseases. But when we parsed the data more, we found the difference was in younger women compared to older women. And even within the same woman, as she aged, we saw that she lost some of these anti-inflammatory molecules. So you can think of it as a shield. If a woman has a stronger immune system that's radiating this light, she's maybe evolved a shield to protect herself against it. But as she ages, this breaks down, and she may be more susceptible to the enhanced effects of her own immune system.
Your immune system is incredible. It fights off infections, heals wounds, keeps you going every single day. But sometimes it gets confused and starts attacking you. That's what happens with autoimmune diseases. First up, Dr. Esther Sternberg. She's a physician, author, and a renowned expert on the mind-body connection. She has spent decades uncovering how stress, trauma, and even your environment can shape immune function and fuel autoimmune disease. Next, Dr. Sonia Sharma, an immunologist leading the Center for Sex-Based Differences in the Immune System. Her lab uses cutting-edge genetics to figure out why autoimmune diseases hit women harder and what's going on deep inside our cells when the immune system goes rogue. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Dr. Sharma, let's start with you. Tell me a little bit about the research going on at the Center for Sex-Based Differences in the Immune System.
Sure, Elise. Absolutely. So at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology, we are uniquely focused on the immune system. The immune system impacts every different organ in your body. And so we believe that every disease, no matter which organ it affects, is an immune disease.
Okay.
So we at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology study every single aspect of the immune system.
Wow.
Every single cell that is involved in eliciting an immune response, every single molecule, and through really through a holistic lens.
Dr. Sternberg, you've done some pioneering work on the mind-body connection, especially how it relates to stress, and it's literally reshaped the field. What inspired you to pursue this research in the first place?
What inspired me was a single patient.
Say more.
I was training in rheumatology as an arthritis doc, and I was called to see a patient on Christmas Eve. It was an emergency consult. The patient was at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And the question was, is this horrible scarring autoimmune disease that this patient has developed related to this experimental drug we've given him for epilepsy? I didn't know the answer. And that set me on a research career. It convinced me that if you do something to the brain, you can develop an autoimmune inflammatory disease. Back then, that was in 1979. And the neuroscientists, immunologists, endocrinologists did not believe that the brain and the immune system could talk to each other.
Wow.
And I was actually, I was told by several of my directors that they said, Esther, you're going to ruin your career. There is no such thing as the brain and the immune system talking to each other. One of my lab directors told me, you'll do that research when grass grows here. But for whatever perverse reason, I continued, really because I was convinced because of that single patient. And that led me to discover that the brain's stress center, the hypothalamus, is important in susceptibility to autoimmune inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis in rats. And when you can prove that in rats, then the scientific community sits up and says, oh, maybe it's not all in your head. Maybe it is in your head, but in your brain, in your brain's connection to the immune system.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, for centuries, it was believed, since actually Descartes, about 400 years ago, that if you can't see it, it isn't real. If you can't see it anatomically, it isn't real. So for a long time, women were considered to be hysterical.
Right.
Hyster is the uterus. Hysterical comes from the term uterus. And And if they had stress or complaints of pain, they were considered that it was just not real. So how do you prove that if you can't see it? Right. Well, fortunately, we, in the last decades have the tools to see, as Dr. Sharma was saying, at a molecular level, at a genetic level, at a brain imaging level, at a cellular level, all of these changes in these diseases. And you can see those in humans. But if you study rats, you can actually manipulate the system. So you can't give somebody arthritis. You can, follow people who already have arthritis, but then it's not clear whether the fact that they have arthritis caused the problem, right. or what caused it. So in rats that start off with no illness at all, if you then can expose them to, in the case of the rats I was studying, little bits and pieces of bacteria, streptococcal cell walls, they get an illness that looks exactly like rheumatoid arthritis. Okay. And so then you can follow them and you can prove in many different ways that that wasn't a coincidence, that the connection between the blunted brain stress response in those rats was the reason that they had a greater tendency to get arthritis.
Yeah. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is the immune system?
So the immune system consists of the cells that populate our bone marrow, but really our blood. And these cells innervate all of our tissues as well. The cells of the immune system are uniquely specialized to mount an immune response, an inflammatory protective response against pathogens, things that we don't want, bacteria, viruses, and tumors. Okay. And that's really what the immune system is.
What does a healthy immune system look like?
Healthy immune system is one that reacts to those invaders, those toxins, those allergens, those bugs, quickly gets rid of them, fills in scars if it's needed, and gets back to baseline. Okay. The problem is if it goes on when all that stuff is taken care of, if it goes on too long, that's when you have a problem.
What is autoimmunity?
Well, I'm going to let Sharma answer some of this, but autoimmunity is when the immune system turns on your own body. It no longer recognizes it as self, it recognizes it as foreign. And just as it chewed up and spit out and got rid of all those bacteria and viruses and whatever, it does that to your own tissues.
So that's absolutely correct. I mean, autoimmune disease develops when your immune system remains inappropriately activated.
Okay. So what are some of the markers that you might see in a woman with autoimmune disease?
Well, this is part of the challenge because in some ways the markers that we observe for autoimmune diseases overlap with some of the same markers that we would see with a virus infection or bacterial infection or even a cancer. Not all of them, but some of them. You might see an increase, for example, in pro-inflammatory cells. So the cells of the immune system, their metabolism is structured in such a way that the minute that they encounter a pathogen, they start to grow, and there are more of them. So that's one of the things that we observe in an autoimmune disease. However, there do exist some specific markers in our blood, usually, of autoimmune diseases. Certain antibodies against self-proteins, we shouldn't be seeing that. And things like that.
Okay. Let's stay on you to talk about what the most common, if you could just list off some of the most common autoimmune diseases today in women, and then just kind of describe each briefly.
Absolutely. And before I go into that, I just want to stress that basically almost all of the autoimmune diseases, and even the most common ones, are severely sex skewed in that they affect women more commonly than men. For some of the more common autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, it's about a 2-to-1 skew. And for some of the rarer ones, which are increasing nonetheless, like lupus or Sjogren's syndrome, it's almost a 10-to-1 skew.
Wow, that's wild.
And what does that mean? That means that today in the US, 75% of autoimmune patients are women. these numbers are increasing.
Let's just tick off and talk through the most common autoimmune diseases that affect women today. And you all can take turns, but just describe each one briefly.
Well, I'll start since I said I'm an arthritis doc. Rheumatoid arthritis, and actually any inflammatory arthritis, is an immune disease that attacks the joints. So any of your joints, you have many joints in your body. And the way we diagnose different kinds of arthritises, inflammatory arthritis, is the kinds of joints, the numbers of joints, the symmetrical distribution of joints. So with rheumatoid arthritis, you get joint inflammation and pain in the small joints of the fingers of both hands, often wrists, often elbows. In other kinds of arthritis, you have just one or two large joints involved. And so that's part of how we make a diagnosis. But also the blood tests, rheumatoid factor, is very important in diagnosing rheumatoid arthritis.
Multiple sclerosis is a condition in which the immune system, T cells in the brain, actually attack the myelin sheath, which is the protein sheath that surrounds our neurons, and results in progressive neurodegeneration, decrease of motor skills, and this is a progressive disease.
Yeah.
Lupus is another big one, systemic lupus erythematosus. It was called lupus because the term lupus in Latin means wolf. And back hundreds of years ago, there was a characteristic rash on the face that looked to doctors and, a few hundred years ago as if a wolf had bitten you. But there's a characteristic rosy rash on the face. But really what it can do is it can affect the kidneys, it can affect the lungs, it can affect the joints, certainly. So it's really a disease that affects pretty much many organs in the body. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is an inflammation of the thyroid gland. And in fact, I have that. And a colleague, an endocrinologist, was looking at me. I was sitting in the office and I was shadowed from the window. And he looked at my throat and he said, "Let me check out your thyroid." He could tell that it was kind of lumpy bumpy, it was larger. And what happens is the immune system turns on the thyroid gland, chews it up, and you end up with scarring of the thyroid gland. So it starts off with a too much thyroid hormone.
Okay.
So you get symptoms of you're hot, you're sweating, you're losing weight. And then when your thyroid gets scarred, you have hypothyroidism. So you're tired, you're gaining weight, your skin changes, your hair changes. And it's the best immune disease to have because it's easily treated.
Okay.
It's treated with thyroid hormone. You just replace the thyroid hormone.
Dr. Sharma, is there a reason that researchers can point to for the high prevalence of some of these in women versus men?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And this goes back to your immune system. Autoimmune disease is a dysfunction of your immune system. Women have a more robust immune system compared to men. That's a fact. Women at almost every level for their immune cells, for their immune markers, they have a more robust response to pathogens, and this makes them more susceptible to autoimmune diseases. Men, in contrast, are more susceptible to the acute effects of an infection and even certain cancers, but they are less prone to autoimmune diseases.
Okay.
I have a question for you. Can I ask?
Great. Yeah.
So I long wondered why that was. And my thought, and maybe there's no proof, but maybe there is proof now, is that through the millennia, females of all species had to deliver babies.
That's right. You're on the right track, I think.
And you had to have a strong immune system to survive the infections. In the last century, there was a huge maternal mortality from infection postpartum after you deliver a baby. So maybe is that why women have a stronger immune system?
That's what I believe as well, that women need a stronger immune system during their or they've evolved a stronger immune system during their childbearing years to protect them and their baby against impending infections. We know that certain viruses like cytomegalovirus as well as Zika virus can harm the fetus as well. And so women need to their immune system during pregnancy needs to toe a very fine line. Protection against foreign invaders, but not to harm the baby.
In modern life, are there other socio or economic factors that play a role in this disparity between?
I think so. I mean, it goes back. So if I can step back a little bit and just talk about, why women have a stronger immune system. First of all, they have 2 X chromosomes.
Okay.
And we know that the genes on the X chromosome are particularly highly enriched for immune genes. And so in some cases, even though there are protective mechanisms to kind of rebalance this, it still goes to stand that women have higher expression of immune genes compared to men.
Okay.
They also have the sex hormones, estrogen. Estrogen is extremely, in general, immune stimulatory.
Okay. And then we get into social factors, economic factors that could then play a role.
For example, birth control. Some birth controls, most birth controls contain both estrogen as well as progestin. And so this boosts the immune system. My lab actually did a study on this where we were looking at differences in metabolism between men and women and how that relates to the immune system.
How does it?
Well, remember I mentioned that, the immune system needs to grow because when it encounters a pathogen, the cells of the immune system need to rapidly divide so that there are more of them. For example, there's more soldiers to fight the invading army. So their metabolism has to be very robust. And when we looked at these differences in metabolism, we found that women had unique metabolic features that translated to the cells of their immune system to make them more robust. And we found that the highest immune metabolic signatures were observed in younger women who were taking estrogen-containing birth control.
Wow. Are there any key differences in how a woman's immune system works and responds compared to a man's?
Oh, yes, almost at every single level. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, so my area of expertise at this point is stress and how the stress response affects the immune system. And there's no question that there are differences in the way that the stress response occurs in males and females, again, of all species. And we can go into that later, but the way that the stress response and cortisol, which is the most potent anti-inflammatory drug that our body makes, the way it feeds back and turns off the immune system when that immune reaction is no longer needed, is very different in males and females. And we can talk about how the stress response is different.
Yeah, that's actually a great time to jump into it because let's just set the table here. What exactly is happening in our bodies during a really stressful time on a chemical level?
So you have to, when you think about stress, you have to think about the thing that happens to you, the stressful event that you have to perceive as stressful. And then what happens in your brain and your body when that stressful event triggers the cascade of hormones from the brain that then eventually lead to production of cortisol, the ultimate stress hormone from the adrenal glands. And what I discovered when I was trying to figure out how that patient got that autoimmune disease is that brain's stress center, the hypothalamus, was blunted and did not produce enough stress hormones in female rats that were tending to get arthritis. Their female rat cousins who produced a lot of these stress hormones were able to shut off the immune system and the immune response as soon as it began, so they didn't go on to get arthritis. The ones that had a blunted stress response that weren't producing enough cortisol to shut off that tap, they went on to get inflammatory arthritis that looked just like rheumatoid arthritis.
A stressed immune system is not a happy immune system. Remember we talked about in the beginning how autoimmune disease basically translates to an immune system that is on when it should be off? Cortisol, the stress hormone, really kind of inverts what should be, in that the immune system ends up being blunted when it needs to be on, for example, when there's an infection, but in contrast, it ends up staying on when it needs to be off. So a stressed immune system is not a happy immune system.
Yeah, and there are different kinds of stressors. There's acute stress, which you need to survive. You have to have your stress response in order to have focused attention, vigilance, the energy to fight or flee. All of us right now here, including the producers, have our stress response turned on optimally, not too much, not too little, so that we can perform at peak. And the problem occurs if you're stressed chronically, like in chronic caregivers, women caught in the middle between taking care of children and their elderly parents, divorcing couples. Chronic stress puts a load on the immune system where those immune cells are tuned down and are not able to fight infection as they should. So with chronic stress, you have more frequent and more severe viral infections, decreased vaccine take rate, speeding of chromosomal aging. If you're chronically stressed, your chromosomes can look 10 to 17 years older than your biological age. How many of us want that?
I don't want old chromosomes.
No, I don't want them either. And speeding of certain cancer growth and slowing of wound healing. So this is well established that chronic stress predisposes to these kinds of diseases because it's blunting the immune system's ability to do its job.
Okay, we have been talking about cortisol, the stress hormone. What role does estrogen play in all of this?
I'm going to give that to you.
Estrogen is a very complex hormone that signals to pretty much all cells in the body, not just cells of the reproductive system as one might think. And indeed, estrogen receptors, because estrogen signal through estrogen receptors expressed on cells, are found on almost every different immune cell type that we find in the body. So estrogen plays in general a stimulatory roles for these cells. It can stimulate, for example, T cell responses. It can stimulate antibody responses, and it can even blunt immunosuppressive responses.
So it's like a dimmer switch.
Actually, it would be the opposite. It's turning that flame up, whereas testosterone is that dimmer switch.
And cortisol is the dimmer switch.
And cortisol as well. Okay. So cortisol and testosterone have that in common. Testosterone is an equally interesting hormone because it's poised almost exactly at the opposite of estrogen. Estrogen is turning up the heat on your immune system. Testosterone is turning it down.
That's fascinating. How does autoimmune risk shift as women enter perimenopause and menopause?
Well, it goes up. I mean, we know that when we look at younger women, they are the least prone to developing autoimmune diseases in general. Okay. But these diseases are age associated. They definitely increase over time. And so as women enter into perimenopause and menopause, they are more susceptible to these autoimmune diseases. We did a study actually of anti-inflammatory molecules in the blood of women as they age. And what we found is that it was kind of unexpected in a way, because when we compared men and women, we found that women had a higher number of anti-inflammatory molecules. And we thought that's strange because they're more prone to autoimmune diseases. But when we parsed the data more, we found the difference was in younger women compared to older women. And even within the same woman, as she aged, we saw that she lost some of these anti-inflammatory molecules. So you can think of it as a shield. If a woman has a stronger immune system that's radiating this light, she's maybe evolved a shield to protect herself against it. But as she ages, this breaks down, and she may be more susceptible to the enhanced effects of her own immune system.
Okay. On the topic of estrogen, pregnancy often relieves some autoimmune symptoms, but then postpartum will bring flares. Why is that?
Yeah, this is likely due to hormonal changes. And as we mentioned, the sex hormones such as estrogen and progesterone they regulate our immune system. And those changes in hormones likely coincide with fluctuations in immune activity.
Okay.
Because again, during pregnancy, the immune system really has to toe a very tight line. The immune system needs to protect mom and baby throughout the pregnancy, but at the same time must prevent mom's immune system from attacking the baby as well. So it has a really fine line to toe. And you mentioned about those flares after. This may coincide to a burst in, for example, estrogen hormones or resurgence of them to protect the mother postpartum. And this may flare up autoimmune.
So is estrogen having opposite effects at different times then? Or is it a balance of estrogen and progesterone, other hormones?
It's both. It is a balance between estrogen and progesterone, and also estrogen levels in low and high concentrations can elicit different effects.
Okay. So the same hormone depending on concentration. So really it's like skincare. It's formulations.
That's right.
Well, it's the same with cortisol. It's the same with the stress. You need your cortisol. You need your stress response in order to perform at peak. But if you have too much, it's not good. If you have too little, it's not good.
Mm-hmm. It's Goldilocks. It has to be just right.
Goldilocks is right.
Yeah. And then we brought this up earlier, but as a follow-up, birth control pills are mostly estrogen. Yeah. Could they help or hurt autoimmune conditions?
So that's a great question. And you mentioned that most birth control formulations contain estrogen. It's usually a combination of estrogen and progestin. And indeed, yes, it is likely possible that if an individual knows that they are prone to autoimmune disease, maybe they have low levels of ANA or other antibodies that denote autoimmune disease. Maybe autoimmune disease runs in their family. They may want to have a conversation with their doctor about taking non-estrogen containing birth control pills.
Why is it that stressful events can trigger autoimmune diseases?
It's a little bit counterintuitive. We know that chronic stress suppresses the immune response, so you're more susceptible to infection, prolonged wound healing, and so on. So you would think that chronic stress would suppress autoimmune disease. Right. But in fact, about 80% of patients who have an autoimmune disease report that it came on after a period of extreme stress. Not necessarily chronic stress. It could be extreme stress in a shorter period. So why is that? Well, we know now that that it's not only cortisol that counts. It's not only how much of the hormone you're producing. Mm-hmm. So when you're producing a lot of that anti-inflammatory cortisol, that tunes down the immune response. But if you're producing it a lot for a prolonged period of time, it also blocks the receptors in the cells, in immune cells, for that hormone. So they're called the glucocorticoid receptors for cortisol. So what happens during chronic stress is those immune cells that Dr. Sharma has been talking about have fewer of those glucocorticoid receptors, those receptors for that hormone. If they have enough of those receptors, they are not sensitive to the hormone. And there's also a decreased ability of that hormone to affect the immune cell. So you have a lot of hormone floating around that's supposed to be anti-inflammatory, but it's kind of like if you have a key to unlock a lock and the lock is stuck with bubble gum. You can't unlock it. You can throw 1,000,000 keys at the lock, but you can't unlock it. And that lock is the receptor for cortisol. And therefore, when you have chronic stress, your immune cells are less sensitive to being tuned down by that anti-inflammatory hormone. And there's couple of other things. There are genetic factors. So there's a lot of reasons why we call it glucocorticoid resistance. You have a lot of the hormone floating around, but your immune cells are not getting tuned down. Now, this is actually the idea of hormone receptor resistance was first discovered in diabetes. And maybe you could talk about diabetes.
So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease in which the immune system, the immune cells, the T cells, attack the beta cells of the pancreas. And these are the cells that produce insulin. So simply put, an individual with type 1 diabetes who lacks beta cells in their pancreas can't produce insulin. And therefore, they can't regulate their glucose, their bioenergetics. And so they need to inject insulin. But insulin isn't a cure. Again, we talked about Goldilocks. And someone who's taking insulin, they have to constantly monitor their glucose levels because they're always trying to play catch up with their body and really regulate properly their insulin levels.
And in a system working optimally, our bodies are already balancing that.
Absolutely. The beta cells take care of that themselves. But if the immune system has attacked its own pancreas, the body's not capable of functioning as it should.
Right.
All right, doctors, we've talked about stress as one of the main autoimmune triggers. What are some other triggers?
Well, we talked about the genetic triggers, and we know that there are certain genetic factors that predispose to developing an autoimmune disease, and not necessarily a particular autoimmune disease. We know that these diseases run in families, but what we often see in familial patterns is that different members of the same family might develop different autoimmune diseases. For example, someone may develop MS, another may develop diabetes, and so on. So we know that the genetics play a role. Okay. We also know that environment plays a role. You know, our environment, we're exposed constantly to environmental toxins. We're exposed to dietary factors. We're exposed to things that regulate our microbiome, which are the bacteria that live on our skin and in our gut. And we know that the microbiome that we receive when we're born, that starts developing even before we're born, these passengers that are with us, they educate our immune system for us. Really important, that microbiome, in teaching our immune system, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do from birth. And we know that different microbiome compositions can predispose to autoimmune diseases. In fact, there have been a few studies that have looked at the microbiome in men and women, and in men and women with autoimmune diseases, and found those to be vastly different.
Wow.
So talking about the genetic factors in those rats that I was studying, if the rats that had a tendency to develop rheumatoid arthritis-like symptoms, if they sat in a sterile cage, not stressed, they lived long and happy lives. But if they were exposed to bits and pieces of bacteria, which of course we all are, that's when they developed the arthritis symptoms, or actually pathogenic. They for all the world had X-ray changes and swelling of the joints and so on, and it is those rats that had this tendency had 20 different genes on 15 different chromosomes that predisposed them to developing arthritis. So each gene didn't have much of an effect, but together they were more prone to develop arthritis when exposed to these simple environmental factors. Their cousins that were resistant, that did not develop inflammatory arthritis, had fewer genes that predisposed them to arthritis, and also had some genes that made them more resistant. So, again, that explains to a certain extent the familial differences, that you may inherit some genes. If you inherit all 20, like these rats, you'll get arthritis eventually when you're exposed to whatever, bacteria or whatever in the environment. If you inherit only 2, you're going to be more resistant. If you inherit half of them, you may or may not get some mild disease. So it's a dose effect of the genes that you inherit combined with whatever it is in the environment that you're exposed to, and different people are exposed to different things.
That's absolutely right. The genetics are complicated and related to multiple genes. And then you add that extra layer of environmental factors. And even in twins who ostensibly have the same genetic makeup, the manifestation of certain autoimmune diseases can be different, and that tells you how important environmental factors play.
So my family is kind of a poster child for this.
Oh, yeah?
Because I went into rheumatology to become an arthritis doc before many of my family members had different forms of autoimmune disease. But my grandmother had probably had lupus. Was hard to know back in those days, but she had lupus. I have a cousin with scleroderma, mixed connective tissue disease. I have thyroiditis. I have probably some version of mild mixed connective tissue disease. So these things run in families, but none of us are exactly identical.
When patients say something like, my gut is a mess and my joints hurt, what's linking these issues?
You know, an immunologist would say the immune system, because again, the immune system, what links our organs is our vascular system and our blood. Mm-hmm. Our immune system lives within our blood. So we believe that what is linking the different, because again, and that relates to multiple autoimmune disease patients who can have multiple events in the same or different organs. Mm-hmm. And what that's telling us is that there are systemic factors that are influencing inflammation. What are systemic factors? These are things, cells, molecules that are in our blood. And so we think there's a destabilization or an inflammatory signature present in the blood that's likely linking these two events.
So if a patient came to me and asked me that question and said, I have, gut problems, I have diarrhea, I have lots of cramps, and I also have pain in the joints. Yeah. The first thing I would do is determine whether they had an autoimmune disease of the gut, like Crohn's disease, or they could have the opposite. They could have rheumatoid arthritis, or they could have lupus that's also affecting the gut. So like you said, these are systemic diseases where there can be multiple organs involved. The treatment is different depending upon what the primary organ is and the primary pattern. So for lupus, it's very different than the treatment for rheumatoid arthritis, for example. So you need to do a combination of looking at the pattern of disease, the organs that are involved, and the biomarkers that can tell you which of these autoimmune diseases the person has.
But it's very tricky because, as you just mentioned, many of the symptoms overlap. Yeah. And so, in some cases, some clinicians, some rheumatologists believe that lupus is in itself not a singular disease, but a collection of many different diseases with the same clinical symptoms. And so this just makes it even more challenging to treat these patients. The other thing I want to mention about treating these patients that's maybe frustrating for them as well as for clinicians is that we end up treating the end organ failure. It's really like playing whack-a-mole, right? The doctor sees the patients when something is going wrong in a particular organ. And it may be this organ and then it may be that organ, but the patient really is only being treated once there is already damage. Mm. And it's really challenging to treat the patient with preventative medicine. Preventative medicine is, of course, the gold standard. And it's really tricky in autoimmune disease because we talked about cortisol. We can't continually suppress the immune system. It just doesn't make sense. Right. Patients can't be on strong immunosuppressants all the time.
This actually gets to my next question because we talked about genetic triggers. We talked about environmental triggers, stress obviously being a huge trigger for certain autoimmune problems. How might something like a tooth infection or an untreated cold then trigger a long-term autoimmune problem?
Well, we know that there is an intimate link between infection and autoimmune diseases. And, we talked about tissue damage playing a role in that when there's an infection, particularly a chronic infection with a bacteria or a virus, that virus or bacteria is replicating in our cells and it's causing cellular and tissue damage. And this is causing everything that should be hidden to come out. Yeah. And the immune system can now see something. The eye of Sauron is all of a sudden seeing something that it didn't normally see. But because that bacteria is there and causing all that damage, now the immune system can see it and maybe attack it. And so I think this also goes back to the question that we talked about, why cortisol in the long term or stress can cause immune suppression, because if it makes us more susceptible to these infections, it can increase this damage and increase the likelihood of this viral mimicry that can initiate autoimmune diseases.
Great segue to return to you, Dr. Sternberg. What is the tend and befriend stress response?
Let's talk about the stress response. So back in the 1930s, when Walter Buchanan described the stress response, and actually Hans Selye, they talked about it as fight or flight, right? Everybody knows what fight or flight is. Yes, we've all heard that. Uh-huh. And up until about 25 years ago, people assumed that male and female of all species had a fight or flight response for stress. Shelley Taylor, who is a professor at UCLA, coined the term tend and befriend because she noticed that in her female mice and rats, when they're stressed, they don't so much have a fight or flight response. They actually tend to take care of their young ones and befriend, cuddle with other females in the cage. Oh. Well, you can think about it when you have your cats and dogs, right? Yeah. If a mom cat and her kittens sees somebody, a stranger coming along, she'll immediately pick up the little kittens and gather them up and put them in the corner, and she is having a stress response protecting her young ones. So that's the tend and befriend response. Why was that not noticed until about 25 years ago? Because scientists only studied male animals. Why did scientists only study male animals? They're easier. They don't have all this complicated changes in hormones every month and changes throughout the cycle, the life cycle, and so on. And in fact, when I was studying my female rats, many of my colleagues said, "Why are you studying females? They're too complicated." And I said, because they're the ones that get the disease. And they said, well, you should study males. No, I studied females because they got the disease, even though they're complicated. So you have different stress responses, different patterns of the stress response to their behavioral patterns, this tend and befriend. Yeah. There's also studies that Professor Kravitz at Harvard has done on fruit flies, male and female fruit flies, and he calls them fighting fruit flies. And he puts the fruit flies on a cork and under a microscope, and if you put two males together with a female, she has to be dead, otherwise she'll fly away, they will fence and box. And they literally look like they're fencing and boxing.
They fight, yeah.
And they fight. So they have a fight or flight response. And the male that wins the first fight ends up winning the rest of them, and the non-dominant male falls off the cork dead. If you put two female fruit flies on a cork with a piece of food in the middle, because that's what they'll fight over, they bump heads a couple of times, and then they share the food. So, and Dr. Kravitz can manipulate the genes to change them so that they can be sort of, females can look like males, males can look like females, and he can change these patterns of fighting behavior. So there are genetic factors, there's behavioral factors, and we found with the rats that we were studying that if we had the high-stress rats, pups, raised by a low-stress pup mother, a low-stress mother, the stress response in the pups would be lower, but not as low as the genetically low-stress pups. And there was a difference in how the males and females pups responded. So there are genetic factors, there are behavioral patterns, factors, there's hormonal factors that cause males and females to respond differently behaviorally to stress.
So now that we understand that there is this tend and befriend stress response in females, how does understanding it maybe help us better care for our immune systems? How do we use this practically?
How do we use all of it practically, not just the tend and befriend? So if I may, I'll tell my own story of developing inflammatory arthritis. So I was going through a period of extreme stress in my life. My mother was dying of breast cancer. I was a long-distance caregiver. I was under a lot of stress at work, and I was going through a divorce. And I developed inflammatory arthritis, not rheumatoid arthritis, but arthritis in sort of my large joints. And I was at NIH at the time, and I plugged myself into an early arthritis protocol at NIH, had knee biopsies. I was supposed to go back into hospital for liver biopsies and knee biopsies. And my mother died. I moved into a new house in Washington, D.C., and I was writing what was to become my first book, The Balance Within, The Science Connecting Health and Emotions. And my neighbors, who were Greek, saw me writing on the deck on my computer, and they came to me and they said, are you an author? Are you a writer? And I said, I don't know. No, why do you ask? And they said, because we've always wanted a writer to stay at our cottage in Crete.
Wow.
And I said, I'm a writer. And so I went with them to Crete only for about 10 days. And instead of going into hospital for all those biopsies, and I came back and I was so much better that my doctor said, you don't need to go into hospital. What were you doing? What was I doing? I was swimming in the ocean every day. I was eating a healthy Mediterranean diet. I was surrounded by my neighbors, by friends, by all the grandmothers of the village who shared their arthritis stories with me, and their wonderful food. I was climbing to the top of a hill above the village where there was a tiny little chapel, Greek chapel with the icons and the candles on top of ruins of a temple to Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. And I would sit there for hours listening to the birds and the goats and the sheep and looking out at the beautiful blue Mediterranean and the fuchsia bougainvillea against the white stucco houses. And I didn't notice that time was passing. I didn't know that I was meditating. I didn't realize until I came to the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine that I was practicing the 7 domains of integrative health. I was sleeping soundly under the stars, so sleep, environment, movement, resilience, which is your stress and relaxation response, relationships, spirituality, and nutrition. And by doing all that holistically, I allowed my body to heal. So I was being treated with anti-inflammatory drugs before I went to Crete, but I wasn't allowing my body to heal. I was working against it by keeping on being stressed, by eating hamburgers and French fries for lunch every day, by being sedentary and so on. And so what integrative medicine is practicing all of these behaviors, all of these activities to help your body to heal, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Of course you need the latest drugs, these amazing drugs that are used now to treat rheumatoid arthritis and autoimmune disease, the monoclonal antibodies, the MABs. But if you fight against it by not taking care of your whole body health, you're not going to allow those drugs to do their best to help you heal.
Also, it may be what we talked about being preventative versus reactionary.
Yes.
Those MABs are really strong drugs that broadly suppress your immune system. You can't be on those all the time. Those are really appropriate for scenarios where there's already been a flare. But I think what you talked about fits into a set of healthy behaviors that supports a healthy immune system, a balanced immune system that may lead more to prevention of these flares or fewer of them.
And while we are on the topic of preventative health, there's a lot of emerging tests that can detect autoantibodies years before symptoms appear. So should women with family histories of autoimmunity get screened preventatively?
Yes, I believe so. If there's a family history, as they age, it's definitely worth having a conversation with their primary doctor and start these testings. Okay. Again, especially when there's a genetic predisposition in the family. Absolutely.
Where are you on this, Dr. Sternberg?
I defer to you in terms of the immune testing, but certainly in terms of stress, engaging in the 7 domains of integrative health is really important for prevention. Diet is really important. Anti-inflammatory diets, Dr. Andrew Weil's anti-inflammatory diet, there's number of them out there. Certainly the Mediterranean diet is anti-inflammatory. And if you eat a lot of very highly processed foods, that can also trigger responses. It's avoiding highly processed foods and eating lots of fresh vegetables, protein in the form of fish, meat, and grain, and basically the anti-inflammatory Mediterranean diet is really important.
One of the things I want to highlight is, as a personal note, I was a child of the 80s and really grew up on this idea of the low-fat diet.
Oh, yes. And I remember those, the snack wells.
Oh, my goodness.
Snack wells with the green boxes?
Full of sugars and carbs. So we were basically raised to believe that all fats are bad, but on the other hand, we should be eating all these processed carbs. And as we've been doing our own research on metabolism and metabolites, particularly in individuals who have inflammation or don't, we're really looking at the emergence of a trend that fats are really important. And we're finding that there's a whole class of anti-inflammatory lipids or anti-inflammatory fats that are required to kind of rebalance our immune system and rebalance our immune cells. And it's really about the types of fats. We're finding those fats in fish, in nuts, we also find them in unhealthy foods as well, but the idea is that we shouldn't ignore the role that fats and healthy fats are playing in rebalancing our immune system.
How about in eggs?
In the egg yolk, absolutely. There's a whole cadre of complex and healthful fats in there, and all of these fats are in general in fatty foods relatively balanced, but we'll find those kind of polyunsaturated fats more in those foods that you tend to associate with health, like fish oils, fish, nuts and walnuts and avocados, things like that.
Okay.
So anti-inflammatory fats are typically thought of as what we call polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, that are often found in fish oil. For example, DHA or EPA or SDA. These are all derivatives of fish oil, fats that are found in fish oils that are all these polyunsaturated fatty acids. Cool. And these exert not only an anti-inflammatory effect on the cells of the immune system, but also they're also what are called vasoprotective. They protect our vascular system, which are really important for heart health as well as brain health, or really any organ health.
And then are you pro like coconut oil and avocado and the fats found in those too? Or?
So that's a good question. And I get that a lot. I get asked that a lot about specific supplements or specific oil types. And I take a more holistic approach because when we're talking about purified or refined versions of any of these fats, the source really matters. Because what we found, for example, there were clinical trials testing the fish oil derivative DHA, which is a PUFA for heart disease. Mm-hmm. And in the end, there really wasn't any protective effect of DHA supplementation on heart disease. And what does that mean? Well, DHA is only one small component of the PUFA family. Mm-hmm. There are many other PUFAs. For example, we talked about SDA or EPA. So what I would say is for each condition, we may not know exactly what the bioactive molecule is. Take it back to basics, go with the whole foods, and go kind of similar to microbiome. Try to sample a diverse array of different fatty foods like avocados. Eat the avocado, eat the coconut, right. Eat the fish. If you don't like fish, you may want to pick a fish oil supplement that's really deriving from a natural source that has a large variety of different molecules in it.
Okay, I have a stat for you. 15% of healthy women show low levels of autoimmune markers like ANA and blood tests even without autoimmune disease. Can we explain why?
So ANA or anti-nuclear antibodies are biomarkers of an autoimmune disease. When they accumulate to a certain threshold level, they usually correlate with the emergence of symptomatic disease. Okay. What does that mean? That means there's real organ damage by the immune system. Those 15% of women who have anti-nuclear antibodies of ANA, what that's telling us is they've had some kind of organ damage that has resulted in that autoimmune response. It's at a low level. What that tells me is that some percentage of those women will likely progress to full autoimmune disease and end organ damage, and that ANA will likely increase, and a small proportion of them will also may maintain at that same rate.
So they may present as kind of healthy.
Yes, because they're not over the clinical threshold. In diagnostic medicine, you have to set a threshold. Mm-hmm. And so there is a threshold of ANA that associates with the organ damage and the symptomatic disease. So that 15% is showing low levels of ANA, and that means that there is something going on there, but it hasn't progressed to a clinical level.
So, but also with like rheumatoid factor and ANA, there can be non-specific triggers, like if you're taking certain drugs. In certain viruses, there seems to have been an increase in rheumatoid factor after COVID, which then disappears once the illness is cleared. So you don't make a diagnosis of an autoimmune disease based on a single,
that's right,
like anti-ANA or rheumatoid factor. It has to have other markers, and as you said, above a certain threshold to make a diagnosis.
Okay. In order to respond to produce ANA or produce antibodies, your immune system has to see something. Again, seeing is believing. So your immune system has to almost take a little snapshot of the different proteins. And when there is wounding or an infection where there is a lot of organ damage, things that are normally inside a healed cell will come out.
Got it.
And your immune system will see that, and it may react to that. That doesn't necessarily mean it's progressed to the autoimmune level. It might not.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in favor of preventative screening, especially if you have a family history of autoimmune disease.
For things like ANA.
Right, but what are the tests, or what should they be screened for?
Yeah, okay. Blood tests are really the central foundation of any kind of preventative screening, because you absolutely don't want to do anything invasive unless you have to.
Okay.
Well, so we would start with, for lupus and other autoimmune manifestations, you would look at ANA levels, which are anti-nuclear antibodies. For type 1 diabetes, you would be looking at insulin levels directly, as well as glucose levels. Yeah. For some of the other manifestations, we would be looking at C-reactive protein or CRP levels. We can examine as well the NLR, or the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. And we can also examine elevated levels of some of the pro-inflammatory cytokines or proteins that are often targeted by the MABs, those drugs that alleviate autoimmune disease. What are these proteins or cytokines? TNF, or tumor necrosis alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta. Those are all things that can be measured, again, in the blood.
And then there's also rheumatoid factor if you suspect rheumatoid arthritis, and other more specific tests for rheumatoid arthritis, citrullinated antibodies, and so on.
Regardless of the type of immune type screening that's being done, I would caution and say that it has to be done longitudinally. And what does that mean? Over a period of days to weeks to even months.
So not just one snapshot.
Yes. And the reason that the snapshot might be misleading is that any doctor would likely tell you, well, yes, you have an elevated NLR. So you have more neutrophils than you're supposed to have. And these neutrophils are inflammatory cells that can really cause organ damage if they go unchecked. But what if you just have a cold?
Right.
And so you really want to differentiate these autoimmune signals or inflammation signals from infection signals. So any type of blood test, and as I said, it should be a blood test, should be done in a longitudinal manner.
Okay.
So, the same applies to measuring your stress levels. So measuring cortisol in the blood or even in the saliva is only going to tell you exactly how stressed you are at that moment in time when somebody stuck a needle in your arm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously your cortisol is going to be up. So in order to know whether you're chronically stressed, you need to measure cortisol frequently. And, you're not going to do that in everyday life. You're not going to have somebody, there will come a time when, just as you can measure glucose continuously.
Yeah.
There are sensors that are being developed. They're not available yet to continuously measure cortisol. But measuring cortisol for research purposes, you need to measure frequently during the day. So salivary cortisol 5 times a day will tell you overall how stressed you are throughout that day. The other way to measure your stress level is through these wearable devices. Every single wearable device, whether it's a wrist worn or ring or chest worn, measures your heart rate and your heart rate variability.
Right.
And with complex mathematics, we can measure the degree to which your stress response is turned on versus your relaxation response. So when you breathe, when you inhale, your heart rate increases. When you exhale, it decreases. So that means that there's a variability of the time between the beats. And that can tell us how much your relaxation response is turned on, which is governed by the vagus nerve, which slows the heart, which is triggered by deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, the kind of breathing you do during yoga, Tai Chi, meditation, simply breathing deeply. Dr. Andrew Weil has the 4-7-8 breathing. There's box breathing. There's many different kinds of breathing exercises that you can look up on the web. You can go to the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine website and check out the different kinds of breathing that you can do to immediately lower your stress response. Because what the vagus nerve does when you breathe in deeply and exhale is it immediately puts a brake on the heart, which has been sped up by the adrenaline response. So there are those two parts of the stress response where you can actually, it's really biofeedback. You can regulate your stress response in the moment, and then over time by engaging in these 7 domains of integrative health.
We've talked about, this reminds me of some of the things that we've talked about with some of our long COVID patients or folks who come in to talk to us about developing long COVID. And long COVID is a syndrome that develops after months to sometimes even years after the initial SARS-CoV-2 infection and COVID disease. And what we're finding is that when we look at the immune response, long COVID is more like an autoimmune disease than anything else.
And it's showing up more prevalently in women.
Absolutely. And there that illustrates that bias. Males are more prone to the acute, severe effects of immediate SARS-CoV-2 infection and COVID disease. They die more frequently. They have more morbid morbidities, whereas women are more prone to the effects of long COVID. And we've talked a lot with some of our long COVID patients about because there aren't really any good treatments for long COVID disease. It's really a chronic kind of low level inflammatory autoimmune manifestation. What can they do that's non-surgical? And one of the things we have talked about is deep breathing. There are others. There's even, and I don't know if you like this, cold plunging. There's oxygenation therapies. And things like that are really non-surgical, but everyday things that can be incorporated that seem to elicit this kind of rebalancing effect on the immune system for these patients. Yeah.
I know you're all about integrative health, but what is one small lifestyle change that could make a big difference for a patient? If you had to name one thing.
There is no one thing that
I thought you might say that.
There is no one thing that fits all.
Yeah.
It's daunting to say 7 domains. Oh my God, I have to change my sleep. I have to change this or that. And that's why we have integrative health practitioners, health coaches. If you're an Olympic athlete, you don't do it on your own. You have a coach. And you can work with a coach to help figure out what is the thing that you need to change most. Sleep is really, really important.
Yeah, what's the role of sleep here in autoimmune conditions?
Sleep is really important. Shakespeare said, sleep that ravels the unraveled sleeve of care. Sleep really does enhance well-being and helps your body repair during the night. I wear a wearable device. I wear this ring. I'm not advertising it, but you can wear a watch and whatever, and it'll track your sleep. And it can tell you when to pull back, when you've overdone it. Exercise is great, but you don't want to overtrain. That's also not good. And again, it depends on the individual. You may need more of a change in your diet. You may need more of a change in your sleep. Being lonely and alone is very bad, especially elderly people. So relationships, loving, positive relationships. The more positive relationships you have, the less likely you are to get frequent viral infections. That's a little counterintuitive because you'd think that you're exposed to a lot of different people, but Sheldon Cohn showed this about 30 years ago. So there's each of those 7 domains can be explored with a health provider, for example, at TIA, to figure out which of those you should work on. Yeah. And you can start small. Let's just work on one of them.
Okay. All right. Are you all ready for some audience questions? Because the TIA community sent in questions for the docs.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. First question from the audience, from the TIA audience. How might someone spot an autoimmune disease?
Certainly if you have joint pain, joint swelling, redness that doesn't go away. When I first developed my arthritis, I had just flown on an airplane, and I thought that I had bunged my knee, but it didn't go away. And then my ankle swelled up, and then my shoulder swelled up. And so here I am, an arthritis doc, and I'm thinking I just bunged my knee. And then I said, the light bulb went off. No, I think I have an autoimmune disease.
So it took a minute, even for you.
It took a minute. But as you said, when you could just have a cold. If you have a runny nose, you just have a cold and it'll go away. So it really, if there are changes in your body that aren't going away, that are unusual. So if you're coughing, you've had a viral infection, you're coughing, you get over it. Maybe you've been taking antibiotics, you have pneumonia, but then it keeps on, it goes on. Fatigue. So when my thyroid, I keep using myself as an example, but
it's great.
Yeah.
You can give approval,
right? So I didn't realize I had thyroid disease, and I was just falling asleep at 7:00 in the evening. And I thought, well, I'm just stressed. I'm just tired, a large workload. I started gaining weight. I thought, I'm eating too much, which I was eating too much, bad foods that were bad for me. but then my voice started to be hoarse, and that's when I coincidentally was with a colleague who was an endocrinologist, and he noticed all that. He noticed that I had changed, and I was cold. For thyroid disease, you can't stand the cold. So all of those things come together, and you say, oh, wait a minute, maybe I do have something. But you can't diagnose the autoimmune disease in yourself.
Right.
You need to see a healthcare provider if you have any symptoms that are going on too long that are unusual for you. Especially, say you talked about multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis, one of the first symptoms that can point you to it is blindness. If you have a blind spot in your eye, I mean, that's like that's serious. So any symptom that is of concern that goes on too long, or things like blind spots that happen, don't wait to see how long that goes on.
But you need to be persistent. I mean, one of the things that is frustrating, again, about autoimmune diseases is that they're often diagnosed once there is an end stage problem, for example, a blind spot. And how do we go back from that? And it would be ideal if we could diagnose and treat these things before they did enough damage for this to interfere with life. And this is one of the frustrating stories that I hear from many patients as well as their family, particularly in the brain diseases, not only multiple sclerosis, but also Alzheimer's disease, where we hear again and again, and this is more of an inflammatory disease, but it's still, I think, falls under the cadre. But we hear often on that mom was complaining about things before. She had brain fog, or she would forget little things. Memory loss is, of course, one of the first manifestations, but was basically told that, she was stressed, that she needed to take it easy. And it really wasn't treated until it became quite progressive and quite interfering. And so you really need to toe that line about being persistent with your healthcare provider. And I love this idea with Tia Health trying to integrate healthcare in a way for an individual, particularly a woman who may not be always comfortable speaking out, to have this structure already there to say, you know what? I've been tired lately. That's not usually like me. That's different. Or, I'm forgetting things, but usually I never do that. I think that communication with your primary care is just really important, and just knowing yourself and trusting yourself.
I agree 100%. And one of the things that happened to me, and happens, I think, to many women, is you don't want to complain to your doctor or your healthcare provider because you don't want them to think you're a hysterical woman.
Right. There's that word again.
So there's some self-censorship going on.
Right. And my feeling is, I don't care if they think I'm hysterical. This is not normal for me. I need to be checked.
This is your health.
This is your health.
And advocate for it.
And the other thing you mentioned about stress, one of the really, really important things to remember when you're feeling stressed and you're trying to engage in these 7 domains of integrative health is that if you can't fix it on your own, you're not a bad person. Don't feel guilty.
It's not a moral failing to not be able to solve your own health problem.
That's right. That's why you need healthcare providers who can look at you holistically and tease apart all the different elements that we're talking about. And stress is not a bad thing. It's just that you need to have a coach that will help you to get through whatever you're experiencing and take care of the illness and prevent whatever illness might be coming on.
Okay, kind of big picture. We'll widen the lens here to close. If you could change one thing about how medicine approaches female autoimmunity, what would it be?
If I could change one thing I would prioritize it in the way to admit that these are conditions that affect everyone, but predominantly affect girls and women, in such that they are becoming a major source of morbidity for girls and women worldwide. Let's prioritize these diseases. There are too many unknowns from a researcher point of view with autoimmunity? What are the causes? What are the early diagnostics? What are the preventions? How do we even classify these diseases? I would prioritize these diseases immediately for research and therapeutic development.
Okay, what about you?
I agree with that. And I would say, listen to your patients and believe them. Don't just assume that it's all in their head, or they're hysterical, or they just have a workload that's too heavy, or they're taking care of elderly parents and young children. Believe them, listen to them, act on it.
What critical gaps remain in autoimmune research for women?
Oh, well, that's a sadly easy question. The critical gaps are understanding the early diagnostic, the preventative measures, as we mentioned, the therapeutic agents or the drugs that won't only just obliterate the immune system, that can't be used progressively. They can't be used chronically. We need better therapeutics. I would say that sadly, the gaps are there at almost every level. And from a research point of view, well, in a way, it's simple. Let's prioritize these diseases. Let's understand them more. Let's fill in those gaps that really are there at almost every level.
Okay.
And I would say also including whole person health, including integrative practices, making sure that not only is your patient, if you're a healthcare provider, receiving the drugs, the therapies, and so on, but also engaging in these lifestyle methods, interventions that can help allow your body to heal, and then going forward, prevent further complications. So it's really combining the two, the state-of-the-art space-age drugs with the tried and true integrative interventions.
And if I may say, I don't think that we would need to necessarily reinvent the wheel to develop new therapeutics for autoimmune disease. We can learn from other conditions, for example, cancer research, where powerful immunotherapy drugs have been developed, for example, CAR T cells. CAR T cells are modified immune cells, modified T cells that are designed to seek and destroy tumor cells. In the same way, those CAR T cells are being repurposed in autoimmune diseases, for example, to target the rogue immune cells, for example, the B cells that are producing ANA, and attack those cells. So in my mind, even the smallest amount of research funds diverted into autoimmune disease could have a very big payoff, because it may be able to not only find new things, but integrate what we already know about immunotherapy from other diseases.
Thank you. Real quick in closing, what do you want listeners to take away from this conversation that we've had about our immune systems?
This is the age of knowledge. We're in the age of AI, and we're in the age of the internet. And in the post-COVID era, even my mother knows what an antibody is. And that's a great thing. So be involved, educate yourself, reach out to folks like us, email, phone to find out more, be engaged in your own health. And I think that's one of the best policies you can have in the age of information going forward.
And I think from the point of view of the provider, certainly work hand in hand with your patients. If you're the patient, work hand in hand with your provider as kind of a health coach who can guide you through this journey. It's not a single time point. It's a long journey if you have an autoimmune disease. So that's really important. And in talking about information, the internet can be so daunting. There's so much on the internet. So it's really important to have the guidance of your healthcare provider that has this holistic knowledge. Yeah. One of the reasons I write books for the lay public is for that reason, to really help the public understand through stories of discovery, through the scientists behind the discoveries, we're real people. We have the same problems as you do. We turn our expertise to trying to figure these things out, and we may not have all the answers, but reading or writing about these experiences and having your listeners read these stories can help them as well.
Okay, fantastic.
And it doesn't have to be only in a hospital. I mean, we have a lot. Come visit the research centers at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology. We love it when lay people and come in and see our lab and tour our lab and talk to us about the things we're doing and finding out more.
Okay, that was an invitation from Dr. Sharma.
Absolutely.
Dr. Sharma, thank you so much. Dr. Sternberg, thank you as well.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Really has.
As a special thank you gift for you, I have these.
Oh,
you
thank
can open
you.
them
Oh
up
my
and see what they are.
gosh.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
And you can put them on if you want, just to try them on.
wow.
They are, can you tell what they are?
They're kimonos.
Are they kimonos?
Yes, they're Tia health robes.
Oh my
Yes.
goodness.
And patients at the clinic actually get to wear these instead of the traditional medical
That is
gown.
amazing. That is amazing.
And they're so beautiful, and it comes with the sash. Hopefully you saw
How
the
do
sash
I get
there.
the arm here?
There's your arm. There you go.
There's my arm. Oh my
you look
gosh.
great. Those are excellent colors on you.
These are delightful.
Gorgeous. Oh my God.
So thank you for coming in person
Well,
and joining us in the studio,
thank
because
you
then you get
so
to
much.
get these and wear them for us on
This is
set.
wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
both.
These are awesome.
Yay. Bottom line, your immune system is powerful and essential, but for millions of women, it's misfiring, and medicine is only beginning to ask why. From genetics to hormones, women's immune systems play by different rules. Hopefully today you got to understand yours a bit better. Big thanks to Dr. Esther Sternberg and Dr. Sonia Sharma. Their work and ways to support your own body are linked below. And please hit subscribe for more conversations that'll change how you think about your health.